The title of my presentation was an international perspective for disaster management. So I'm on the World Road Association, or PIARC. It's the same organisation, two words, on their disaster management committee. It was a very humbling experience at first, because I came into there with people from Chile and Japan who had experienced real life incidents, huge calamitous, deathly incidents, and we have rain and a bit of flooding. And I kind of thought at the beginning of this 4-year cycle, what can I add? So hopefully by the end of that you'll be able to see what I was able to add. So what we started out with was, how do we define disasters? And again, there's lots of definitions, but this guy Enrico Quarantelli from United States carried out lots of pioneering work in disaster management, and he founded the US Disaster Research Center. And it's become one of the single most kind of prolific storers and amassers of good quality research and information on disasters throughout the world. So if you're into this, then definitely worth a look up for the DRC. And the other kind of introductory thing to say is that obviously risk and disaster is nothing new to being considered by PIARC and World Road Association. So this in fact is the kind of 4th cycle. So in the previous 3 cycle, we published a report, as you do, and they've kind of progressed, but they've kept the core themes of man-made and natural disasters, risk management, but also introducing the behavioural aspects, the social aspects, which is obviously one of the key areas of the research that we did this time. So this kind of 4-year period, we've looked at 2 kind of key areas. One, what information is used within managing disasters, and then how disasters are managed. I've been on the working group for number 1, so a lot of what I'm going to talk today is the kind of information management side. And then just to give some guidelines, so the report will be published I think later on this year. There's the Abu Dhabi World Road Congress in October, where it will be presented, and there will be a kind of a web manual as well. So for those of you who are interested in these reports, you can just sign up as a member and you can get access to them. It's free; they're freely available. So there's a huge amount of kind of international learning on these sites. So the 2 working groups got together and really decided, well, how do we scope and frame the work that we're going to be doing this 4 years? So part 1, disaster information management, which I was involved in. Basically, we looked at the kind of the range of hard and soft management techniques that different countries use to manage disasters over the kind of timeline. So the kind of mitigation, preparedness, response and recovery phase. And that's where we came up with these two key areas. One was disaster management with the public, and the other was about information sharing and management. The kind of 4 key areas, I suppose, we looked at were how organisations kind of develop and use their communication structures. How do they gather information? How do they then use that information in disasters to communicate and inform the public? And also kind of road response and other response organisations. But also how organisations provide both road users with information, but also other technical information as well, to allow them to make more informed decisions. And in terms of disaster management with the public, we looked at kind of emergency response systems and how they behave within a timeline. So the diagram you can see on the right-hand side shows kind of a timeline from an immediate reduction in the kind of system performance, and then a recovery rate. And that recovery rate depends a large amount on how prepared you are and how quickly you put into place your recovery mechanisms. But it also has a kind of thin slice, as you can see, or a thin wedge in terms of how the public engage with that disaster. And the more informed they are, and the more informed in terms of making the kind of the decisions that as an organisation or client body you want to see, that helps recover the situation quicker. As common with all of these projects, we did a survey to start with. So again, these surveys are quite unique because they're largely based on the people you have within your committees. Okay, so it's not able to go to every country across the world, but you do have some key players. And for this survey, we had 11 countries and got 19 responses. And you can see big mix of those countries that you would say, yeah, you recognise they have major disasters. but other countries where you say, well, okay, Denmark, what's interesting about Denmark in terms of how they have or manage disasters. And again, the way that we planned the survey was on the timeline. So you'll see in the bottom diagram. So it was all about from what happens from when the emergency occurs and how quickly do organisations recover and how information is used in that process. So some of the findings. First of all, we looked at how kind of public information and technical information and the interaction of those two things. And what we found was with some of the countries that they're very closely linked, but some of them are much more kind of disparate. So you'll see that 8 out of the 12 countries that responded have quite a very small overlap in terms of the using of those two kind of bodies of information. But what we found was with the more kind of advanced countries, and that's not necessarily developed countries, but those more advanced in disaster management, they had single management or emergency management centres which actually hosted both types of that information and were able to then align the messaging for those, and that then fed the kind of information cases, the information with kind of common messaging. So the next thing we looked at was about the difference between kind of single mode disasters and multiple mode disasters. So some of the countries that we were looking at, so Japan for instance, it doesn't just stop with the earthquake. You then could have tsunamis, you could then have other disasters following on. So what we looked at was how public and technical information relate to one another for both the kind of response and the recovery stage for single modes and multiple modes. And again, as it says there, so it's, treating public and technical information separately can be effective, not in all cases, where you have single mode disasters, but when you have multiple mode disasters, it's really important that those are much more closely aligned. We also looked at the kind of range of communication tools which countries have. And again, the bottom right diagram, I think for me was quite key. So this was an advanced country with very high-tech communications, and even in the disasters that they had in 2011, it took 14 days to re-establish wireless networks. So it just for me, it kind of highlighted the point that you can't just rely on what you have. You have to have multiple layers of resilience, even with your kind of communication networks. And so I'm not suggesting you have to go back to pigeons, but you do have to have, some fairly simplistic backup systems in case of disasters. The survey also looked at the kind of key disaster types, and most of the speakers have talked about these. So obviously we had lots of case studies from occurrences of heavy rain and the impacts of heavy rain and flooding. We also had landslides and earthquakes as well. And as I said, the survey concentrated on the kind of how organisations face disasters, what policies they have to set in place certain kind of actions and responses, but also what methodologies and management styles that they have as well. And we also, and again, you won't be able to read these, you will do on a slide though, but we looked at a range of countermeasures which, again, international countries use to reduce disaster impacts, from the kind of hard to soft range, but also looking at the impacts and the effect on reducing the impacts as well. So I'm going to take you through a few case studies. So the ones that we selected, these obviously illustrate different points. And I think it's worth saying before I go into these that the scale of these disasters compared to what we have in the UK can be, obviously very, very different. And also that not all countries have adequate preparedness plans, which is why some of the learning that I'm going to highlight in these is more attributable or more interesting for developing countries. But I also think that there are points here which the UK can learn from as well. So first of all is Chile. So again, the statistics speak for themselves. Horrific impacts felt with both earthquake and tsunami. So again, multiple mode disaster. Some of these points might seem obvious to you, but obviously they had a big impact in the learning and the way that their organisations have changed. So the first one, information flows from the emergency, not to it, is quite interesting, because if you're the Prime Minister or the head of state, and you are looking to get information and give an address to the public in your organisation, actually it's the people at the hard, sharp end who have the best information, and sometimes it's quite difficult to get the same messages across. The other thing that they looked at was adopting formal language to avoid misunderstanding or lack of communication. And again, I know in the UK we've spent a lot of time trying to formalise, not just the bronze, silver, gold, but the kind of language we speak. Because once it gets out into the media, these things have a way of having very different kind of word usages to describe a similar incident. The protocols was another big thing which they realised that they had to refresh. And the last one was interesting as well. So in terms of decision making, the higher hierarchical levels, as they called it within the organisation, tend to request information to make a decision that must be made on site, not at headquarters. And I think therefore, they need to be made sure that the information is available at the disaster site, which again relies on there being good communication networks at all times. So the second case study is Dominican Republic. I don't know anyone lucky enough to have been there. They obviously have a huge amount of storms, cyclones, and they realised, back in the late 90s, that they needed a better way of managing these incidents and disasters. So they set up their Emergency Operations Centre in 2001, again, to try and bring in some of those things that the Chile case study highlighted, so there was one version of the truth, there was common messaging about disasters. They have phone apps so that the public automatically gets sent notices of disasters which are brewing, for want of a better word. But they also recognised even now that maintaining that information flow with all the organisations and stakeholders is still very key. So moving around the world to Japan. So again, they had some snow, which we would say okay. But for them, I think the fact that even though it caused what I would see there as 38 hours of road closures is a lot, didn't kill anybody, but it caused a lot of disruption. So again, they viewed it obviously as a major incident / disaster. So as a result of that, they set up an information communication headquarters for not just Snowfall but other disasters as well. And again, similar to what we have in the UK, this is a multi kind of stakeholder response capability. But they also recognise that common information needs to be issued, it needs to be easy to understand, useful for all transport modes. And again, the last point, visual images add confidence, which is what a number of speakers have already said. And in fact, I think the next case study moves on to another level. But they also recognised that the way and types of the way that information is given out to the various types of media was really important. So again, like the UK, they use kind of radio, email, web pages, SNS, which is social media, and cable television. The question I would have is, yes, those are all kind of recognised in this country, but do we really think that we use those to the best of our ability? And in such a coordinated way. So it was almost as if they could, as it says there, they could have emergency interrupt to broadcasts, almost like you'd have someone sitting you'd have Steve sitting in DFT, and we would suddenly your TV program would switch to Steve, and Steve would say, right, I need to talk to you about, warn this. So I don't think we're quite there yet, but it's something that they obviously feel is quite important in terms of informing their public. Second Japanese case study was interesting because this is obviously all about GIS and the use of data, which again is relevant to earlier presentations today. So obviously background with the Kobe earthquake and disaster, collapsing bridges, and I think there was just a lot of unknown, unpredicted things that would happen in the event of an earthquake. And the Hanshin Expressway, again, my colleague who helped me prepare this, who works on that, obviously lived through that. And they realised that they needed a much better system to manage disaster information. And it wasn't just knowing what inventory and assets they had, but how they would behave under different scenarios. And they recognised that a comprehensive disaster information system was required, not just to communicate with the public, but also to manage their assets, and be able to respond to their assets. So their system, and he did add that it's still not there yet, so it's still work in progress, because these things, do take a lot of time. But they collected a lot of basic information, and the idea is that there's a lot of preparedness built into it, but you actually update the system during the incident. So they wanted a comprehensive GIS database. They wanted to be able to plot earthquake damage, tsunami inundation, because they honestly recognise that this is going to happen again. So it's not just this disaster's happened, that's the end of it. They know these are going to happen again. So it's about being more prepared and about giving that information to their recovery and response teams quicker and in a more consistent way. So moving on again to Australia. The reason why this case study stood out was because the state Queensland realised again back in, I think, 2012 that it needed a statewide system of managing information and again preparedness for disasters. So it managed to set up and deploy within a 12-month period the State Department Coordination Centre, which is a 24/7 centre. And it's used to manage all sorts of incidents, weather-related, natural, man-made disasters. And again, some of those bullet points on the right-hand side are quite interesting, because for a more developed society, that third one, the need to protect and manage government's reputation, is quite key. Because one of the things that information can do is damage reputations across all levels. And they recognised that having good and consistent and quality information and the single source of truth was people might be quite cynical about it in terms of, well, that's what the government would say, and et cetera, et cetera. But they did recognise that as one of their objectives. And the key principles were interesting as well. And these are what they think about every time they put information together and before they actually give information out to the public. So it's making sure it's empathetic, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I think that's why this stood out as different from other organisations. Well, recently, they tested it and they managed it in their 2013 floods, and it came out of the other side as being seen as being very successful. And in their annual report last year, I got some facts and figures. They dealt with 47,000 inbound emails, and they dealt with 2,800 weather warnings across, this is just one state for the year. And they also had oversight of 6,500 state emergency service tasks. So whenever the blue lights are deployed, they have oversight of that as well, and they manage those incidents. So, if you compared that to what we do in the UK, we certainly don't do that as a region, okay? But it just shows a lot of joined up thinking that could be possible if you got multiple stakeholders together. I think the bullet on the right-hand side, the information outlets, again, very similar to Japan. Again, Queensland also look after the seaboard as well. So that's why the notice to mariners, they also deal with information given out to shipping as well. So again, it's that multi-sector view, which is quite interesting. So then they had Cyclone Debbie in 2017. Again, severe tropical cyclone. Again, that system worked well. It was considered a success, but they also had some more learning. So the communication learning, they needed to tighten up on the coordination between district staff and key stakeholders. They also had loss of power on their mobile network. So again, there were communication issues still that they needed to learn from. The third one's interesting because one of their key aims is kind of economic recovery. So it's looking at, depending on the time of year that these disasters happen, helping the economy, and in this instance, kind of protecting harvests from flooding, was actually a key driver in their recovery phase. The ones I've kind of underlined here, they also looked after, so number 4, Flood Recovery Road Access Group. So they actually formed a group within their committee which looked at permitting heavy goods vehicles in the recovery phase from a disaster, which is something you kind of think, well, why would they need to do that? But it was important because obviously they had a network of roads which wasn't 100%. So they had to actually make sure that the right vehicles were using the right networks and not causing more disruption. To California, again, the reason why we picked this as a case study was because of the social networking and that kind of visual response to disasters and the visual kind of images reinforcing the messages. And as it said on the right-hand side, they have really taken to using, as they call it, SNS communications more widely. But they also recognise that the way that information is given out has to be very clear to get through to the kind of the ardent, I'm not leaving my house, I'm not leaving my, my land customer. And the graphics certainly add to that. So what they're now doing, again, the learning that they've taken from that is to actually use the analytics side of social networking more, so they can actually track who is looking at their posts in which geographical departments, so that they can see whether their messages are getting through or not, and if not, obviously reinforcing those, or maybe physically going to those areas to try and up the amount of people who are taking notice. A couple of UK studies. So, Forth Road Bridge. So I had really good chats with Hugh Gillies from Transport Scotland about this one. Obviously, he lived and breathed through this. We kind of call it a disaster. It was a disaster, I think, for people who lived around there because it caused a huge amount of disruption. And the learning, I think, that we got as a committee from this case study was the speed at which things had to evolve. So they had to formulate a repair and response plan, which they did within 2 days, and I think it was 2 solid days with no breaks, and create the staff rotas for that then next period of recovery. They created an event, and again, a lot of this wasn't set up because they didn't think something like this was going to happen. So they had to set up a major event cell, but they also realised, again, the smart people at the top, that this was likely to cause, huge kind of scrutiny in the future, and it did. So obviously they recognised early on there was going to be a government inquiry, so everything had to be really well recorded, not just for kind of sharing of knowledge and preparedness for the next time, but also because they knew they were going to be asked lots of serious questions. Steve's nodding his head. Social media was very key. This phrase, feeding the media machine, was quite interesting about informing customers about what was happening at all stages of the recovery, and you can see the facts figures on the right hand side in terms of the increase in social media uptake for during the closure, and I think the last bullet point on the right hand side is quite key, because lots of the presenters today have talked about that as different types of skills and capabilities that our resources need to have. And I think, for me, one of the big learnings from today is that there's such a lot of new things happening that, again, we need to go back to our learning establishments and make sure that they are also helping to teach those new skills and capabilities, because we can shape those, I think, as an engineering sector when they come to us. But I think the learning's got to start right at the beginning. Okay, so the last case study is from Northern Ireland, and the reason why this was picked because it had a big community kind of coming together. So the background to this was 2012, where they had significant rainfall and flooding. They developed a strategy, but they also recognised that they didn't have the funds, the budgets, or the kind of maintenance responses to be able to deal with a similar occurrence in the future. So they formed this regional community resilience group in 2013, and really that's taken off. So a lot of the cities have their own groups, and they're spreading out to other parts of Northern Ireland now. And as it says in there, it's about helping local communities to prepare and respond for themselves. And they all have their own plans. They all get the materials to allow them to respond quickly and take that pressure off the emergency services. So there's a nice photo of sandbags in a porta cabin. But self-help, I think, was the key phrase coming out of this study, as well as communication. So, as I said, not huge disasters, but an example of where local communities can actually get together, understand the issues, understand why the emergency services and the responses can't do everything for them. So there has to be that element of self-help. A couple of slides on conclusions. So again, throughout these 4 cycles, and this project in particular, risk awareness obviously is a key influence. Developing countries can use shared learning, and one of the policies of PIARC is outreach to developing countries. So a lot of what we do, we try to embrace developing countries within our project. We go out and we organise seminars, workshops in developing countries, again to try and share the learning. The other key points were, it's not just developing a mitigation strategy, but also the adaptation element, and that's something I know David talked about. Social networking obviously is there, it's here to stay. It's how can organisations, countries use that more effectively. And the last point, effective disaster management engagement is a potential strategy for mitigating effects of disaster events. That behavioural side, that social side is really key for all organisations. Thank you.